The prison cell reeked of sweat and despair. The walls, once white, were now stained yellow from years of neglect. In the dim, flickering light, Jonathan Reed sat on the edge of his cot, his bony fingers tapping rhythmically against the metal frame. He was a man who had spent the last 20 years of his life behind bars, convicted for a series of brutal murders that had terrified an entire state. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was dying. The warden stood by the door, his arms crossed. 2 guards flanked the room, their expressions blank. But it was the priest, Father Thomas, who seemed the most uneasy. He held a small Bible in his hands, his fingers twitching as he flipped through the pages. "Jonathan," the priest said, his voice steady but cautious, "this is your final chance to confess, to make peace with whatever is waiting for you on the other side." Jonathan chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that sent chills through the room. "You think I'm afraid to die, Father?" He shook his head. "Death isn't what scares me." Father Thomas swallowed. "Then what does?" Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes dark, hollow. "I never killed her," he whispered. The priest frowned. "Killed who?" Jonathan's lips curled into a smirk. "The last one, the hitchhiker." A heavy silence filled the cell. The warden exchanged a glance with the guards, but no one spoke. Everyone knew the case. Jonathan Reed had murdered at least 12 people. His final victim, a young woman named Emily Carter, had disappeared just like the rest. Her blood had been found in the trunk of his car, her broken necklace on the side of the road, but her body was never recovered. "She never died," Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She's still out there, watching, waiting." The priest took a step back. "That's not possible." Jonathan grinned, his teeth yellowed and uneven. "You'll see." The warden cleared his throat. "Enough of this nonsense. It's time." The guard stepped forward, grabbing Jonathan by the arms. He didn't resist. Instead, he chuckled to himself, shaking his head as they led him down the long, cold hallway toward the execution chamber. As they strapped him to the chair, the priest whispered a final prayer. The warden read his last rites. And just as the executioner flipped the switch, Jonathan muttered one final sentence under his breath. "She's coming for me, and then she's coming for you." Midnight on Route 66. 2 weeks later, Sheriff Daniel Brooks tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove down the desolate stretch of Route 66. The old highway was mostly abandoned at this hour, the only company being the occasional flicker of a dying streetlight. He had been patrolling this road for years, but tonight, something felt off. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. His radio crackled. "Sheriff, you there?" He grabbed the receiver. "Go ahead, dispatch. We got a report of a stranded vehicle near mile marker 237. Possible hitchhiker sighting." Daniel frowned. "This late? Caller said they saw a young woman standing by the road. When they circled back, she was gone." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. He had heard this story before, too many times. He turned on his siren and sped up. The miles blurred past, the dark road stretching endlessly before him. When he finally reached mile marker 237, he saw it, a rusted blue sedan. Its hood popped open. Steam hissed from the engine, but the car was empty. No driver, no passenger, no hitchhiker. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. The wind howled through the trees, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. Then he saw it. A single silver necklace, half buried in the dirt. Daniel's breath hitched. He knew this necklace. He had seen it 20 years ago in the evidence locker. It had belonged to Emily Carter. His blood turned to ice. And then, from the shadows, a soft voice whispered, "Help me." Daniel spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but there was no one there, just the empty road and the growing sense that something was very, very wrong. End of chapter. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Girl. The wind carried an eerie stillness as Sheriff Daniel Brooks scanned the empty highway. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his breath visible in the cold night air. The whisper had been real. He had heard it. A soft, desperate plea for help. But there was no one there. His fingers clenched around the silver necklace he had just picked up from the dirt. It was the same necklace from the Emily Carter case, a case that should have been buried 2 decades ago. And yet, here it was. Daniel swallowed hard and activated his radio. "Dispatch, this is Brooks. I need confirmation on something." A crackle, then the familiar voice of his night dispatcher, Linda. Go ahead, Sheriff. I just found a necklace at mile marker 237. I need you to cross-check it with the Carter case from '03. See if it matches the evidence record. A long pause. Then Linda's hesitant voice came through. Sheriff, that's not possible. Daniel frowned. Why? Because that necklace was destroyed years ago. After the trial, the evidence was cleared out. There's no way you found the same one. Daniel's grip tightened around the cold metal. He could feel the engraved initials on the pendant. E.C. Emily Carter. His stomach twisted. Either someone was playing a very sick game, or something far worse was happening. Before he could respond, his headlights flickered. The air around him seemed to shift, the distant hum of the highway growing impossibly silent. Then, in the corner of his vision, movement. A figure. A girl standing just beyond the reach of his headlights, barely visible in the shadows. Daniel's throat went dry. Who's there? No answer. He slowly reached for his gun, his pulse hammering against his ribs. I said, who's there? The figure took a step forward. The light caught her face. Pale, hollow, familiar. Emily Carter. Her eyes were wide, dark, empty. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't even exist. And yet here she was. Daniel took a cautious step forward. Emily? His voice barely carried in the thick air. Her lips trembled. Then, in a whisper that made his skin crawl, she spoke. He lied. Daniel's breath hitched. What? Emily took another step closer, the air around her growing colder. He lied, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's mind raced. Jonathan Reed, his final confession. He had claimed he never killed Emily, that she was still out there. But how? Before he could ask, the air shifted again. The ground seemed to pulse beneath his feet. His headlights flickered violently, and in that brief moment of darkness, she was gone, vanished. The only thing left was the silver necklace in his trembling hand. A ghost in the system. Daniel barely remembered the drive back to the station. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind spinning with what he had just seen. Or had he seen it at all? Maybe exhaustion was getting to him. Maybe his brain was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew what he had witnessed was real. And if Emily Carter was still out there somewhere, then everything about the Jonathan Reed case had been a lie. When he pulled into the station, he found Linda still at the dispatch desk, sipping lukewarm coffee. She looked up, startled by the way he slammed the door behind him. Sheriff, what's wrong? Daniel dropped the necklace onto the counter. Tell me this doesn't match the Carter case. Linda hesitated, then picked it up. As soon as her fingers touched the metal, she flinched. What the hell? She turned it over in her palm. It's identical. Her voice wavered. Sheriff, where did you find this? Daniel exhaled sharply. Right where Emily disappeared, mile marker 237. Linda paled. But that's... I know, Daniel interrupted. 20 years. And now, out of nowhere, this shows up, and He hesitated. He knew how crazy it would sound. I saw her, Linda. Linda's fingers trembled around the necklace. Saw who? Emily, Daniel said quietly. Linda stared at him, her eyes widening. That's not funny, Sheriff. I'm not joking. His voice was grim. She was there, and she told me he lied. Silence. Linda set the necklace down like it burned her fingers. He, as in Jonathan Reed? Daniel nodded. Linda swallowed hard. But he's dead. Daniel leaned against the desk, rubbing his temples. Yeah, and now his last victim is showing up on a highway where she disappeared 2 decades ago. He could see the fear creeping into Linda's expression. She had worked here long enough to know that some things just didn't add up. Maybe she's trying to tell you something, Linda whispered. Daniel nodded. Yeah, the problem is, I have no idea what. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, a knock. A slow, deliberate knock at the front entrance of the station. Daniel and Linda exchanged a glance. No one came to the station this late. Daniel's pulse quickened. He reached for his gun and moved toward the door. Through the frosted glass, he could see the outline of a figure standing just outside. He unlocked the door, pulling it open just enough to see. But there was no one there, just the empty, dark street. Then, a whisper, faint, hollow, right behind him. Help me! Daniel spun around, but the station was empty. Except now, the necklace was gone. And in its place on the desk was a single, blood-stained note. 4 words. Find the other bodies. The Hitchhiker's Revenge, Chapter 3, The Unmarked Graves. The station felt colder than before. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stood frozen, staring at the bloodstained note lying on his desk. Find the other bodies. His pulse hammered in his ears. The words looked rushed, desperate, written in a shaky hand. But the blood, fresh, dark, still wet, sent a chill through his bones. Linda, standing behind him, covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Sheriff, who left that? Daniel's throat felt dry. No one was at the door. His own voice sounded distant. At least no one I could see. He carefully reached out, picking up the note with 2 fingers. The edges curled slightly, the dark crimson smeared against the cheap paper. Jesus, Linda whispered. What does this even mean? Daniel exhaled sharply. It means Jonathan Reed didn't just lie about Emily Carter. His eyes darkened. He lied about everything. Buried secrets within minutes. Daniel had the Carter case file spread across his desk. Old crime scene photos, witness reports, newspaper clippings. He flipped through them with a growing sense of unease. 12 confirmed murders. 12 bodies found. But now, a question he had never thought to ask surfaced in his mind. What if there were more? What if Jonathan Reed's true body count was higher? What if some victims were never discovered? Daniel grabbed the note again, his mind racing. Who left this, and why now? Linda hesitated before speaking. Sheriff, what if Emily wasn't the only one left behind? Daniel looked up. She pointed at the note. What if there are others, other victims that Reed never confessed to? Maybe that's what this is about. Daniel's stomach twisted. If that were true, it meant there were unmarked graves somewhere. And Emily, if it really was her, was trying to lead him to them. He grabbed his coat. I'm going back out there. Linda's eyes widened. Alone, he gave her a firm nod. I need to see if I missed something. Stay here and keep the radio on. Linda hesitated, then nodded. Be careful, Sheriff. Daniel pushed through the station doors, stepping into the cold night. The highway stretched out before him, endless and dark. He had a sick feeling that whatever he was about to uncover wasn't meant to be found. The road to nowhere. The drive back to mile marker 237 was eerily silent. Even the usual hum of the wind against his truck felt off. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter. Who the hell had left that note? His mind replayed what had happened earlier. The necklace, the voice, Emily Carter's face in the darkness. He had spent his entire career chasing criminals, solving cases. But this was different. This was something he couldn't explain. As he pulled up to the spot where Emily had vanished all those years ago, the headlights cut through the fog rolling in from the trees. The abandoned blue sedan still sat there, steam no longer rising from the hood. Daniel stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. Everything looked the same empty road, the same eerie silence. But this time, something felt wrong. The air was heavier, charged. It was like the ground itself was holding its breath. Daniel's gut twisted. He scanned the area with his flashlight. Then, a sound. A soft, distant weeping. Daniel's pulse spiked. He turned sharply toward the woods. The sound was coming from deep inside the trees. His flashlight flickered. The batteries were new. That shouldn't have happened. The weeping grew louder. A voice. Faint, choking on tears. Please, help me. Daniel's throat tightened. It was her. Emily. He gritted his teeth and stepped forward, pushing past the tree line. The darkness swallowed him whole. The deeper he went, the colder it became. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something rotting. Then he saw it, a clearing in the trees, and in the center, a shallow grave. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The dirt was freshly disturbed. Someone had been here, recently. His flashlight flickered again, then died completely. Darkness closed in around him. Then, a whisper, right behind him. You found it! Daniel spun around, heart hammering against his ribs, but there was no one there. Just the endless trees. The whisper came again, softer this time. Help them. Daniel's skin crawled. He turned back to the grave and knelt down, brushing the dirt away with his hands. The moment his fingers touched the soil, the ground shifted beneath him. The dirt caved in. Daniel stumbled back, his breath catching as bones, pale, skeletal remains became visible beneath the loose earth. His stomach lurched. This wasn't just one grave. There were several bodies buried on top of each other, stacked like forgotten secrets. Jonathan Reed's victims, the ones no one ever found. Daniel staggered back, his mind reeling. This was bigger than just Emily Carter, and somehow she had led him here. His radio crackled to life, Linda's voice sharp with panic. "Sheriff, are you there? We need to get back. Now." Daniel grabbed the radio. "Linda, I found them. The bodies. There's more than we ever thought." Linda cut him off, her voice shaking. "No, Sheriff, you don't understand." A pause. "Then, they just found Emily Carter's body." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The radio slipped from his grip, his breath stalled in his chest. If Emily's body was just found elsewhere, then who the hell had been leading him here? Behind him, the trees rustled. A shadow moved. A voice, soft, hollow, and right at his ear. "Emily, you're too late." Hitchhiker's Revenge, Chapter 4, The Watcher in the Dark. Daniel's breath stalled. He could feel it. Something standing behind him. Close enough that the air felt colder, pressing against his back like an unseen presence. His instincts screamed not to turn around. But he had no choice. Slowly, his fingers brushed against the cold grip of his gun. He took a deep breath and spun. Nothing. Just the dark, endless trees. But the silence was wrong. The wind had died completely. The air felt thick, suffocating. And somewhere in the distance, buried beneath the weight of the night, a whisper. A breath. Someone was still here, watching, waiting. Daniel exhaled sharply, trying to push down the growing sense of dread clawing at his chest. His eyes dropped back to the shallow grave, the remains barely visible under the disturbed dirt. His heart hammered. If Emily Carter's body had just been discovered elsewhere, then who had led him here? And more importantly, why? A call from the dead. Daniel grabbed his radio, his hands still unsteady. "Linda, repeat what you just said." Static. Then her voice sharp, urgent. "Sheriff, the state police just confirmed it. They found Emily Carter's remains 20 miles from here. DNA matches. It's her." Daniel's throat tightened. This wasn't possible. Where exactly? He forced himself to ask. A pause. Then Linda's voice came through. Hesitant. "An unmarked grave, Sheriff." Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned back to the remains in front of him. Another unmarked grave. A sick realization dawned in his gut. There was more than one Emily Carter. Not literally, no. But Jonathan Reed hadn't just killed 12 victims. He had buried them in different places, hidden them, erased them. The whispers weren't just from Emily. There were others, and they wanted to be found. Daniel clenched his jaw. "I'm coming back to the station." He grabbed his flashlight, ignoring the way his pulse refused to slow. As he turned toward his truck, his foot hit something hard beneath the dirt. A wooden plank. Daniel frowned. He knelt, brushing more soil away, until the faded, cracked lettering became clear beneath the beam of his light. "Help us." A grave marker. Handmade. Carved by someone who had known these victims weren't going to be found. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a burial site. It was a mass grave. And whoever had written this, whoever had left the note at the station, knew about it. Maybe they were even still watching. The passenger. Daniel wasted no time. He jumped into his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly as he sped back toward town. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark. He could feel the weight of what he had just discovered pressing against him. If these bodies had been here for decades, then that meant someone, possibly more than one person, knew about Reed's secret. Maybe Reed hadn't acted alone. Maybe the real monster was still out there. Daniel's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, and his stomach dropped. A figure sat in the back seat. Pale, still, eyes locked on his. A woman. No, a girl. Daniel's breath hitched. He knew that face. Emily. The truck veered as he slammed the brakes, tires screeching against the pavement. His heart pounded violently as he turned. Gun drawn. Nothing. The back seat was empty. The only thing left was the faint scent of rotting earth lingering in the air. Daniel swallowed hard, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He wasn't losing his mind. He wasn't. But if Emily Carter was already dead, then something else was haunting him, something that didn't want him to stop. A stranger at the station. When Daniel finally pulled into the station, his nerves were shot. He barely remembered getting out of the truck before he was pushing through the front doors. Linda jumped up from her desk. "Sheriff!" He didn't stop moving. "Tell me everything they found." She nodded quickly, flipping through her notes. State police uncovered her body in a shallow grave outside of town. She was wearing the same necklace you found earlier. Daniel's head snapped up. That's impossible. Linda swallowed. There's more. She handed him a file. They ran additional forensics. Sheriff, they found 2 sets of DNA on her remains. Daniel frowned. 2? Linda hesitated. One was Jonathan Reed's. No surprise there, but the other... She trailed off, looking uneasy. Daniel's pulse pounded. Linda, who does it belong to? She licked her lips. That's just it. They don't know. There's no match in the database. Daniel felt a cold dread settle in his chest. Meaning? Linda's voice dropped to a whisper. Meaning whoever helped Jonathan Reed has never been caught. Silence. Then, a knock at the door. Slow, deliberate. Linda paled. It's almost 2 a.m. Who the hell? Daniel held up a hand, motioning for her to stay put. He reached for his gun, heart hammering against his ribs. The station door had a frosted glass window, just like before. A shadow stood behind it, tall, unmoving. Daniel exhaled slowly and stepped forward, gun ready. Who's there? No answer. His fingers tightened on the handle. He pulled the door open just enough to see, but the porch was empty. The street, silent. Linda's voice came from behind him. Sheriff, look. Daniel turned. His blood froze. On the floor, just inside the station, a small, dirt-stained teddy bear, and wrapped around it, a torn piece of Emily Carter's dress. End of chapter 4. Bro, this is getting crazy. Dull. The station was dead silent. Daniel stared at the small teddy bear on the floor. The fabric was filthy, stained with something dark, mud or worse. The piece of Emily Carter's dress was wrapped around its neck like a noose. Linda took a slow step back, her breath shallow. Sheriff, this wasn't here before. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. The front porch had been empty. No footsteps. No sign of anyone. Then how the hell did this thing get inside? His instincts screamed trap. He took a deep breath, knelt down, and carefully picked up the doll. The fabric was rough, the stuffing old and uneven. As he turned it over, his pulse stalled. There was something sewn into its back, a lump hidden beneath the stitched fabric. Daniel reached for his pocket knife, cutting carefully along the seams. As the stitching unraveled, something slipped out and landed in his palm. A cassette tape, small, black, the kind that belonged in an old recorder. Linda covered her mouth. What the hell? Daniel exhaled sharply. We need to listen to this. Linda hesitated. Sheriff, what if it's cursed? Daniel shot her a look. He had seen enough to know this wasn't just some sick prank. Still, he had to know. The tape. Daniel found an old cassette player in the evidence room. His hands felt strangely heavy as he pressed the tape inside and hit play. A few seconds of static, then a voice. Soft, weak, terrified. He's coming. Daniel's breath caught. The voice was female. Young. Emily Carter. The recording crackled again. I didn't mean to get in his car. I was just cold, so cold. He said he'd take me home, but he didn't. Linda whispered, "Oh my God." Daniel gritted his teeth as the tape continued. He drove past my house. I told him to stop, but he just kept smiling. Said I reminded him of someone. I don't know where we are now. The trees are too thick. There's no road anymore. Like a loud thud, Emily gasped. Daniel felt his grip tighten on the edge of the desk. Then a second voice, deep, distorted, male. Don't fight it, sweetheart. It'll be over soon. The sound of struggling, heavy breathing, a muffled scream. Then silence, static hissed through the speakers. Then suddenly a new sound, a whisper. But it wasn't Emily. It was closer, right up against the microphone. And it was not human. You should have left her alone, Sheriff. Daniel slammed the stop button. His chest rose and fell, his breath ragged. That wasn't Jonathan Reed. It wasn't Emily. Then who the hell was it? Buried lies. Linda was pale. Sheriff, that voice. Daniel clenched his jaw. It knew my name. And that meant one thing. Whoever or whatever left this tape wasn't done yet. Daniel grabbed his coat. I'm going back to mile marker 237. Linda grabbed his wrist. Are you insane? He yanked free. Emily's trying to show us something, and I'm not about to let some damn ghost scare me off. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. Fine, but you're not going alone. Daniel hesitated, but deep down, he knew she was right. He wasn't safe. Not anymore. The return. The drive was quieter than before. Linda sat beside him, gripping the door handle. "Sheriff, you don't actually believe in ghosts, do you?" Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "I believe in evidence," Linda scoffed. "Well, the evidence is currently whispering threats from beyond the grave, so forgive me if I'm a little nervous." Daniel didn't answer. His thoughts were tangled. If Emily was leading him to the graves, then that meant someone else was trying to stop him. Someone who wasn't dead. As the truck neared mile marker 237, Daniel slowed. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the edge of the forest. Then, a shadow. Standing on the side of the road, Daniel hit the brakes. Gravel crunched under the tires. Linda gripped his arm. "You see that?" Daniel's pulse pounded. He reached for his gun, stepping out of the truck. The figure stood just beyond the light. Still, waiting. Daniel lifted his flashlight and froze. It was a man, middle-aged, tall. His clothes were old, ragged, his eyes dark and hollow, locked onto Daniel's. But the worst part, his face. Daniel had seen it before. In the case files, in the mugshots. It was Jonathan Reed, the serial killer who had been executed 20 years ago. And he was smiling. Chapter 6, The Man Who Shouldn't Exist. The world seemed to stop. Daniel's grip tightened on his gun as he stared at the impossible Jonathan Reed. Standing on the road, the same Jonathan Reed who had been executed 20 years ago. Linda's breath hitched behind him. That's not real. Daniel wasn't so sure. The man in the headlights didn't move. His lips curled in that same eerie smirk from his old mugshots, except now his face was paler and thinner, like he had crawled out of his own grave. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but he had spent his life facing monsters. If Jonathan Reed had returned from the dead, then Daniel was going to send him right back. He raised his gun. "Hands up! Now!" Reed tilted his head, amused. Then he spoke. His voice was wrong. Not deep like in the old interrogation tapes, but distorted, hollow, like something was speaking through him. "Sheriff." The way he said it sent ice through Daniel's veins. "You're on the wrong road." Daniel steadied his aim. "Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them." Reed just chuckled, a low, rasping sound. "You think that's going to stop me?" Then, he took a step forward. Daniel pulled the trigger. The gunshot split the night. Reed's body jerked. His chest snapped back, but there was no blood, no wound, no pain. He kept walking. Linda gasped. "Sheriff, that didn't do anything." Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. His bullet went through the man like he wasn't even real, but his smile never faded. Reed took another step, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "She doesn't want you here, Sheriff." Daniel's throat tightened. "She?" Reed's grin widened. His head tilted just slightly, tacked toward the trees. Daniel felt the cold air shift, and that's when he heard it, a whisper. Feminine, weak. "Emily." Daniel's heart stopped. Then, without warning, Reed's body convulsed. His head snapped back unnaturally, his mouth stretched open wider than any human jaw should be able to. Then the voice changed. It wasn't Reed's anymore. It wasn't even male. It was her. "Help me." Daniel's blood ran cold. Then Reed's body collapsed, like a puppet with its strings cut, just gone. The moment he hit the ground, the headlights flickered. The forest returned to silence. No footsteps, no breathing. Daniel exhaled, his grip still tight on his gun. Reed's body had vanished, but Emily's voice still echoed in his ears. "Help me." Buried truths. Linda was still shaking. "Sheriff, what the hell just happened?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "I don't know." But he knew one thing. Emily Carter was not at rest, and Jonathan Reed, whatever thing had worn his face tonight, was trying to warn him. Something else was hunting him. And it wasn't done yet. Daniel inhaled sharply, forcing his thoughts back into focus. He needed to get back to the station. Needed to figure out what the hell was going on before something worse happened. He threw the truck into gear and sped back toward town, his mind racing. Who was she who didn't want him digging deeper? And why was Emily's ghost asking him for help? The message. The station was eerily quiet when they arrived. Linda was the first to notice it. "Sheriff, your office light is on." Daniel frowned. He hadn't left it that way. Hand on his gun, he pushed the door open and froze. Someone had been in here. Papers were scattered across the desk. His bulletin board, the one where he had pinned photos of Emily's case, was different. Someone had moved things. No, not moved. Rearranged. Daniel's eyes narrowed. The photos, the notes, the red string connecting them. It wasn't random. It was a message, one that hadn't been there before. 4 words were now circled in red ink. Don't dig her up. Daniel's stomach twisted. Someone knew what he had found, and they were watching him. Linda's voice was barely a whisper. Sheriff, what if this isn't just about Emily? Daniel swallowed hard. Then he noticed one last thing. His old cassette player sat on the desk, the same one they had used to listen to Emily's recording. But now, there was a new tape inside, one that hadn't been there before, and scrawled across the label in the same red ink as the board. Play me. Daniel's pulse pounded. Someone was playing games, but the worst part, he had a feeling they weren't human. End of chapter 6. Wrote chapter 7, play me. The tape sat there taunting him, a simple black cassette, its label scrawled with those 2 words in red ink. Play me, Linda swallowed hard. Sheriff, don't. Daniel ignored her, his gut screamed trap, but he had no choice. Someone or something wanted him to hear this. With steady hands, he pressed play. The recording. At first, nothing, just the soft hiss of static, then a voice. Soft, hollow, feminine. He buried me alive. Linda gasped. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. It was Emily Carter. Her voice was weak, fragile, like she was speaking from somewhere far away. I scratched at the wood, screamed until my throat bled, but no one came. The static crackled. A faint sound echoed in the background, something scraping, clawing. He told me I'd never be found, that the earth would keep me. Daniel's pulse pounded. His fingers hovered over the stop button, but he couldn't press it. Emily's voice grew softer. But I know you're listening, Sheriff. I know you can hear me. Daniel's breath caught. Don't let me stay here. A pause. Then a new voice. Low, raspy, not human. You should have left her alone. The sound of something slamming against wood, then screaming. Emily's screams. Muffled. Choking. The sound of nails scratching, tearing, desperate. Then silence. The tape clicked. Stopped. Linda was shaking. Sheriff, she's still out there. Daniel stared at the cassette. His mind raced. Emily Carter was buried alive, and she was still waiting to be found. The hidden grave. Daniel grabbed his coat. We're going back. Linda's eyes widened. Sheriff, I don't care if it's a ghost, a demon, or some sick bastard playing games, he snapped. She deserves to be found. Linda hesitated, then nodded. Then let's end this. Mile marker 237. The road was deserted. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees. Daniel killed the engine. His headlights bathed the empty highway in pale light. Then he noticed it, the dirt beside the road. It had been disturbed. Daniel's stomach tightened. A small patch of earth looked smoother than the rest, like someone had buried something there recently. He grabbed a shovel from the back of the truck. Linda whispered, "What if we find a body?" Daniel didn't answer. He just started digging. The soil was damp, heavy. Every scoop made his arms ache, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Thud. The shovel hit wood. Linda covered her mouth. Oh my God. Daniel dropped to his knees, pushing away the dirt with his hands. His fingers brushed against something hard. A box. A small wooden coffin. Daniel's heart pounded. He reached for his crowbar, forcing it under the lid, and pried it open. What's inside? The smell hit first. Rot. Decay. Inside, wrapped in a torn white dress, was a body. Small. Fragile. Emily Carter. Her skin was pale, waxy, her eyes closed, lips slightly parted, like she had just stopped breathing. Daniel's stomach turned. They had found her. After 20 years, Emily Carter had been unearthed. Linda gasped. Sheriff, her hands. Daniel looked. Her fingers were bloody. The wood inside the coffin was scratched to hell. She had tried to claw her way out. Daniel clenched his jaw. That bastard buried her alive. Then, Emily's eyes snapped open. Linda screamed. Daniel stumbled back. Emily's lips moved. Her voice wasn't human anymore. You should have left me. Her body jerked violently. The air grew thick, suffocating. Daniel felt a hand on his shoulder, cold, raw. He turned and saw Jonathan Reed standing behind him. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. Grave Warnings. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Jonathan Reed stood right behind him. His grin was wide, unnatural. His face was eerily still, as if frozen in time, like a corpse pretending to be alive. But his eyes, they weren't human. Deep black, swirling like empty voids. Daniel's body refused to move. Every instinct in him screamed, "Run, run, run." But his legs stayed rooted in place. Then, Jonathan spoke. His voice was low, distorted, like something else was speaking through him. "You shouldn't have dug her up, Sheriff." The air around them shifted. The wind stilled. The trees stopped moving, like the world was holding its breath. Linda was whimpering behind him. "Sheriff, what do we do?" Daniel's grip tightened around his gun. His training told him one thing: eliminate the threat. But how do you kill something that's already dead? The eyes of the dead. Jonathan took a slow step forward. His boots didn't even crunch the dirt, like he wasn't really there. Daniel lifted his gun, aiming it between Reed's eyes. "Don't come any closer." Reed stopped. That eerie grin never wavered. Then he tilted his head. "I warned you?" His voice shifted. It wasn't his anymore. It was Emily's. "You should have let me sleep." A cold hand wrapped around Daniel's wrist. Not Reed's. Emily's. Her dead fingers clenched around him, her grip unnaturally strong. Daniel looked down. Emily Carter was standing. Her body should have been dead. But now she was moving, breathing, staring. Her eyes weren't lifeless anymore. They glowed. Pale white. Unnatural. Her lips moved, voice barely a whisper. "You let him find me." The words sent a spike of ice through Daniel's spine, because she wasn't talking about Reed. She was talking about something worse, something that had been waiting for them to dig her up, something that wasn't human. Daniel's pulse pounded. His body screamed to run. Then Emily's grip tightened, and the ground beneath them split open. Mouth of the grave. The dirt collapsed. A hole formed beneath Emily. Deep, dark, endless. Like the earth itself was swallowing her back, her body convulsed, her limbs jerked unnaturally. Her mouth opened wide, far too wide, unhumanly wide. Then she screamed, a sound that wasn't meant for human ears. The wind rushed back through the trees, the sky darkened, and Jonathan Reed, he just stood there, smiling. Daniel grabbed Linda's arm. "Run!" She didn't hesitate. The two of them bolted toward the truck, the wind howling behind them. Daniel didn't dare look back, because he already knew what he'd see. Emily's body being dragged back into the ground, her hands clawing at the dirt, and Jonathan Reed watching, waiting, smiling. The warning. Daniel slammed the truck door shut. His hands shook as he fumbled the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. He spun the wheel, speeding away from the grave, from her. But just as the headlights swept across the trees, he saw him. Jonathan Reed. Standing right by the road, still grinning, still watching, and in that moment, Daniel realized something horrifying. Jonathan wasn't the real monster here. He was just a messenger. The thing that had taken Emily, the thing that had been buried with her, it wasn't done. Daniel's blood ran cold, because in the dim glow of his dashboard, he saw something new. Carved into the inside of his windshield, 4 words, deep, bloody. "You brought me back, and I'm the passenger." The words on the windshield dripped. "You brought me back," carved deep, fresh, like someone had just finished writing them. Daniel's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. His stomach churned with a sick realization. Something was in the truck with them. Linda's breath hitched. "Sheriff?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel didn't look at her. He didn't dare take his eyes off the road, because in his peripheral vision, he saw it. A shape. Sitting in the back seat, a third passenger. Something that hadn't been there when they got in. Daniel's pulse thundered. The truck's engine hummed too loud. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Linda's hands trembled. She reached for the rearview mirror. Daniel grabbed her wrist. "Don't." Too late. Linda's eyes widened. Her body went rigid. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Daniel kept driving, kept his eyes locked on the road, because he knew If he looked in the mirror, if he acknowledged it, it would know. It would know they could see it. And then it would be too late. The thing in the backseat. The highway stretched on, dark and empty. The only light came from the pale glow of the dashboard. The truck rumbled over the cracked asphalt. The engine stuttered. And behind them, something shifted. The sound of fabric creaking, like someone was leaning forward. Linda was shaking. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Daniel spoke slowly, carefully. "Linda, look at me." Her eyes stayed locked on the rearview mirror. Her pupils dilated. She looked like she was staring into something endless. Daniel reached for her. Cold fingers brushed his neck. He froze, a breath, right against his ear. "You shouldn't have dug her up, Sheriff." Jonathan Reed's voice. But it wasn't Reed. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Kept driving." "Ignore it. Keep driving. Don't listen." Linda suddenly gasped. Her whole body jerked. She was staring at something. Daniel's jaw clenched. He couldn't look. He wouldn't. But then, the whisper changed. A new voice. Soft, hollow, familiar. "Help me." Daniel's chest tightened. His hands trembled on the wheel because that voice, it was Emily's. The choice. Daniel's breath was ragged. He forced his eyes on the road. "Don't turn around." But Emily's voice grew weaker. "Please, it hurts." Linda's head tilted. Her lips trembled like she was about to say something. Daniel snapped. "Don't talk to it." Linda's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping her seatbelt like a lifeline. The truck lurched. The lights flickered. The radio crackled. A low hum buzzed through the speakers like 100 voices whispering at once. The backseat creaked. Something shifted closer. Daniel's skin crawled. A weight pressed against his seat. Too close. The whisper changed again. Low, rough. Jonathan Reed's. "Look at me." Daniel's grip tightened. His breath came in short bursts. He knew what this was. A game. The same one Reed had played with Emily. If Daniel acknowledged it, it won. If he looked in the mirror, he lost. The truck jerked. The engine whined. Daniel steeled himself, forced the words out. "You're not real." A beat of silence. Then, laughter. Low. Cold. The kind that makes your bones feel wrong. Daniel's vision blurred. The road twisted. Black shapes slithered across the pavement, like shadows crawling toward them. Linda clutched his arm. "Sheriff, we need to stop." No, his voice was firm. "Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't acknowledge it." The laughter faded. The radio static hummed. And then a whisper in his ear. "You already did." The empty road. The truck's tires screeched. The world snapped back. The radio died. The lights flickered, then stabilized. The truck rumbled down the road. Daniel's hands were slick with sweat. His body felt heavy. Linda gasped for air, clutching her chest. The weight in the backseat was gone. The presence had vanished. Daniel exhaled. "Are you okay?" Linda nodded shakily. Did we make it?" Daniel didn't answer, because his heart was still racing. Something felt wrong. He glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The backseat was empty, but in the glass, a handprint pressed against the inside of the window, smudged, bloody, and just beneath it, a single word written in the fog. "Soon." Edge. Chapter 10, The Hollow Man. The bloody handprint stared back at Daniel. His chest tightened. His mind screamed at him to wipe it away, to erase it, but he didn't move, because deep down, he knew. It wouldn't matter. The thing wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Linda let out a shaky breath. "Sheriff, what do we do?" Daniel swallowed hard. The truck's tires hummed against the empty road. Miles of darkness ahead. No houses, no streetlights, just emptiness. He couldn't stop. Not here. He forced his voice to stay steady. "We keep driving." Linda turned to him. "To where?" Daniel exhaled. "To the only person who might have answers. Father McCarthy." The church on the hill. 40 minutes later, the truck rolled to a stop in front of St. Augustine's Church. It was old, too old. The wooden structure leaned slightly like it had witnessed too much. The stained glass windows stared down at them, glowing faintly under the moonlight. Daniel stepped out first. The night air was thick with wet earth and decay. Unnatural silence. No wind, no insects. Linda hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel nodded. "If anyone knows about this, it's him." He stepped forward. The moment his boots touched the first step, the church bell rang, once, twice, 12 times, midnight, but something was wrong. The bell's echo stretched too long, warping into a low groan, like the church itself was in pain. Daniel ignored it. He grabbed the iron handle and pushed the heavy doors open. The air inside was thick, stagnant. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long, trembling shadows. And at the end of the aisle, kneeling before the altar, Father McCarthy. His back was hunched, his fingers twisted into a clutching prayer. Daniel's boots as he approached. Father. McCarthy didn't move. Linda shifted uneasily. Sheriff, something's wrong. Daniel stepped closer. His pulse quickened. McCarthy's lips were moving, whispering. Daniel's breath hitched, because he wasn't praying, he was repeating something. Over and over, a single phrase. He's already here. Daniel's blood ran cold. Father, who's here? McCarthy's shoulders trembled. His fingers dug into his robes, his whisper was dry, hollow, the hollow man. Linda took a step back. Who? Who? McCarthy's head snapped up too fast. His eyes were white, no pupils, no soul. Linda gasped, oh God. McCarthy's lips curled into a too-wide grin. No, candles blew out. Darkness swallowed the church, and in the silence, a whisper right behind them. Found you. The hollow man. Daniel spun. Gun raised. Nothing. Just shadows, empty pews. Linda's breath came fast, panicked. Sheriff, I don't think we're alone. Daniel's heart hammered. Then the church creaked. Wooden beams groaned overhead. The walls shuddered. And from the farthest corner of the church, a shape unfolded. Tall, unnaturally tall. It stepped forward, the hollow man. Its body was wrong. A long black coat hung from its frame, dripping like wet cloth. Its hands, too long, fingers tapering into razor-thin points. And its face, no face at all. Just a smooth, empty surface. No eyes, no mouth, just a void. Daniel's stomach dropped. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The hollow man tilted its head. Then it laughed, low, deep, impossible. The sound came from everywhere at once. Linda grabbed Daniel's arm. Sheriff, we have to go. The doors slammed shut. A whisper curled through the air. Too late. The price. Father McCarthy let out a ragged breath. His body twisted violently, his spine arched backward. Then his skin split open. Linda screamed. Daniel stumbled back, McCarthy's chest ripped apart, his ribs cracking as if unseen hands were peeling him open. From inside, a shadow crawled out, slithering, unfolding. It merged with the hollow man. The laughing grew louder. Daniel fired. Bang, bang, bang. The bullets vanished into the hollow man's chest, swallowed by the darkness. It took another step. The air grew thick. The walls groaned. Daniel's limbs felt heavy. His lungs burned. The hollow man lifted a hand. Daniel's vision blurred. A voice slithered into his mind. You brought her back. Daniel choked. Memories flooded his mind. Emily's body, her lifeless face, her whisper in the truck, the warnings, the handprint. He had brought her back. And now, something else had come with her. The hollow man's fingers reached for him. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't fight. It had won. Then, a voice, small, familiar. A rush of cold air, the hollow man's hand stopped inches from Daniel's face. The church shook violently, the walls cracked, and behind the hollow man, another shadow formed. Small, fragile, Emily, she stood between them. Her face was still pale, still dead, but her eyes, they were her own, not his. Her voice trembled. You can't have him, the hollow man screamed. A sound that split reality apart. The candles burst back to life. Daniel gasped. The weight lifted. He stumbled back, his lungs dragging in air. The hollow man reeled. Emily stood her ground, and in her empty, lifeless eyes, Daniel saw something he hadn't before. Defiance. End of chapter 10. Bro, Emily just stepped up. Chapter 11 is going to be chapter 11, Between Worlds. Emily stood between them. A dead girl facing the hollow man. The air crackled. The church trembled. Daniel's heart pounded. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Emily, his little girl, was standing against the thing that had been hunting them. But was it really her, or was it something else? The hollow man's scream shattered the stained glass windows. Shards rained down like jagged rain, yet they never touched the girl. She was untouched, unafraid. And then, for the first time, the hollow man stepped back. It hesitated, like it wasn't sure anymore. Emily's voice was soft, firm, final. Leave. The hollow man twitched, its faceless head cocked like it was considering. Then a whisper, not from its mouth. It had no mouth. The voice spilled into Daniel's mind. She is not yours to save. The hollow man lunged. Emily lifted a hand, and everything changed. The rift opens. A howling wind exploded from Emily's small frame. A force rippled through the church, shaking the walls. Daniel stumbled back. Linda screamed. The hollow man staggered. It clawed at the air, trying to hold on. But Emily's presence was stronger. Her voice echoed, not just in the room, but in Daniel's mind. I was never yours, and neither is he. The hollow man's form began to unravel, like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. The walls of the church twisted. For a split second, Daniel saw something beyond them, something impossible. A vast, endless void, a place where things moved that shouldn't exist, where shadows had teeth, and within that void, more of them. More hollow men, watching, waiting. Daniel's stomach turned. Was this where Emily had been? Was this where he had pulled her back from? The hollow man let out one final enraged wail. Then it was gone, ripped out of existence. The air grew still. The church fell silent. Emily turned, and Daniel finally saw her up close. Her small face was pale, too pale. Her eyes, hollow yet full. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a demon. She was something else. Something caught between two worlds, and she had come back for him. The truth unveiled. Daniel's voice shook. Emily, she smiled, a small broken thing, and then she cried. Tears slipped down her pale cheeks. Daniel's chest tightened. He had spent years grieving her, years blaming himself. Now she stood in front of him, but what was she now? Linda inched closer. Sheriff, is that really her? Emily's eyes darkened, and suddenly Daniel felt it, a weight in his chest. A memory, not his own. Flashes of a cold, endless place. Hands pulling at her, whispers promising she would never leave. The hollow man had tried to keep her there, but something had brought her back. Something worse. Emily's lip quivered. Daddy, I tried to stay away, but you, her voice cracked. You pulled me back. Daniel's throat went dry. Because he knew she was right, digging up her grave, unraveling the mystery. He had opened the door, and now Emily was stuck. Between the world of the living and the place she had escaped from, her body shuddered, her form flickered. She was fading, being pulled back. The hollow man might have been defeated, but his world still wanted her. Emily gasped, clutching her arms. Daddy, help me! Daniel's heart nearly stopped, because this time he couldn't save her. The final choice. The church groaned, the air thinned. Linda backed away. Sheriff, what's happening? Daniel barely heard her. His daughter was slipping away, and this time it was his fault. Emily reached for him. Please, don't let them take me again. Daniel clenched his fists. He had brought her back. But she didn't belong here, not fully. She was trapped in between. A voice whispered in his head. There is only one way. He knew what it meant, and he hated it. Tears burned his eyes. Emily, her small fingers clutched his jacket. I don't want to go back there. Daniel's heart shattered. The thought of her returning to that place. Alone. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. But if he didn't, something worse would come next. Emily's body flickered again. Her voice cracked. Daddy, I'm scared. Daniel bit his lip. Tears rolled down his face. He had two choices. Let her go back to the void, or keep her here and risk bringing something far worse into the world. His hands shook. His heart ached, and then he made his choice. He opened his mouth and spoke the words that would change everything. End of chapter 11. What did Daniel choose? Chapter 12. The ultimate sacrifice. Emily's small hands clutched Daniel's jacket, her wide, hollow eyes pleading. Her body flickered, caught between two worlds, hers and theirs. The air was splitting apart. A force rippled through the church, shaking the wooden beams and cracking the floor. Damn it. Something was coming. Something far worse than the hollow man. Emily's voice quivered. "Daddy, please." Linda stood frozen behind him, too terrified to move. "Sheriff, we need to do something. Now!" Daniel's mind raced. He had opened the door, and now he had to close it. But that meant he had to let her go. Forever. His entire body screamed against it. He couldn't lose her again. But if he didn't, this world would never be the same. The church's walls began to twist. The wooden planks warped, stretching into impossible shapes, and in the darkness, they were watching. The other hollow men, dozens of them, standing just beyond the veil, waiting. And Daniel knew if he hesitated any longer, they would step through. Goodbye. Emily was shaking. Her pale fingers tightened on his shirt. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. Tears pooled in her empty eyes. Daniel's chest ached. He lifted a trembling hand and touched her cold, fragile face. "Baby, you don't belong here." Emily shook her head violently. "No. You brought me back. I'm real." His heart broke. "I know," his voice cracked. "And I'm so sorry." Emily's lips quivered. The wind howled through the church, pulling at her. She screamed, "Daddy, please, hold on to me." Daniel's grip tightened. His soul was tearing apart. But then, the whispers grew louder. A deep, inhuman voice slipped into his mind. "Decide, Sheriff. The door will not stay open forever." Emily's fingers began to fade. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. He looked at her one last time, his daughter, his world, and then he let go. Emily's eyes went wide. She reached for him, but it was too late. The wind ripped her away. Her scream shattered through the church, piercing his heart, and in an instant, she was gone. The shadows rushed backward. The hollow men vanished into the void. The walls of the church snapped back into place, and the air fell silent. Daniel dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. His body felt empty, like his soul had been torn in half. Linda was crying. She whispered, She's really gone." Daniel wiped his face. He didn't say a word, because there was nothing left to say. The price of redemption. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, Linda spoke. What now?" Daniel's voice was hollow. "We go back." Linda hesitated. "And what do we tell people?" Daniel's fingers curled into fists. The truth, that he had dug up his dead daughter, brought her back, and nearly unleashed hell itself, no one would believe him. No one could. So he simply muttered, "We tell them it's over." Linda nodded slowly. She helped him up. Daniel took one last look at the altar, the place where Emily had stood, where he had lost her. Again. Then, without another word, they stepped out into the cold night and left the past behind. But some doors never stay closed. 3 days later, Daniel was sitting in his kitchen, staring at his untouched coffee. His mind felt hollow. His house felt wrong, too quiet. Then, a sound. Soft, faint, a tap, tap, tap against the window. Daniel's breath hitched. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned, and there, a small, pale handprint on the glass. His blood turned to ice, because it wasn't just any handprint, it was hers. And this time, it was on the inside. End chapter 13, the handprint. The kitchen grew colder. Daniel's breath hitched. His eyes locked on the small, pale handprint pressed against the inside of the window. That was impossible. Emily was gone. He had let her go. He had closed the door. So, how? His heart thundered as he stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, he told himself he was imagining it. Maybe it was an old smudge, maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see. But then, the handprint moved. A second tap, then a third. Soft, faint, like fingertips brushing the glass. Daniel's stomach twisted. And then, a whisper. Not outside, not in his head. Right behind him. Daniel spun around, nothing. His pulse pounded in his ears. The room was empty. The house was silent. But he wasn't alone. He could feel it. Something was watching. Something was here. And he had no idea if it was really her or something pretending to be. Shadows in the dark. Daniel's hands shook. He needed to move. He needed to leave. But his legs felt frozen. Then, a soft creak, the floorboard behind him. Daniel's breath caught. He turned his head slowly, and there, just at the edge of his vision, a small figure, standing in the dark hallway. Silent, Still, watching him, Daniel's fingers curled into tight fists. His voice came out hoarse. "Emily?" No answer, just breathing, soft, hollow, too slow, and like something trying to mimic the sound of life. His chest tightened. He had seen this before. This wasn't Emily, not anymore. His mind screamed at him to run. But something about the way it stood there, like it was waiting, like it was trapped. Daniel's throat went dry. He couldn't move. Would you abandon her again? The thought slithered into his mind. His breath came in shaky gasps. No, he wouldn't. Even if this thing wasn't truly her, he had to know. He had to see. Slowly, so slowly, he took a step forward, and the thing in the hallway tilted its head, like it had been waiting for him to come closer. The wrong reflection. Daniel swallowed hard. His fingers hovered near his gun. But what good was that now? He stepped forward again. The hallway was dark, too dark. The shadows stretched wrong, bending at unnatural angles. But still, he kept moving. And then the figure took a step toward him. Daniel's stomach lurched, because now he could see it clearly. The small frame, the long tangled hair, the white nightgown. It looked like Emily, but something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. Her head cocked too far. Her arms hung limp at her sides. And then her lips curved into a smile. But it wasn't Emily's smile. It was something else. Something that didn't belong on a human face. Daniel's breath came short and sharp. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave this house and never come back. But then it spoke voice. The voice was hers. "Daddy, why did you let me go?" Daniel's chest tightened. The air around them grew thick, heavy, suffocating. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't listen. The figure took another step, then another. Too close. Its head tilted again. Its lips parted, and then Daniel saw the truth, the reflection in its eyes. Not of him, not of this house, but of the other place, the void, and the shadows within it were still watching, still waiting, and somehow, some way, they had found a way back. The door was never fully closed. Daniel's blood ran cold. His hand moved instinctively, gun drawn. But deep down, he knew this wasn't something he could kill. This wasn't something he could stop. He had made his choice, and now he was paying the price. The figure took one last step. Then, it whispered, "You shouldn't have let me go." And in the next heartbeat, the lights went out. The entire house plunged into darkness. A scream split the air. Not from the figure, from Daniel, because the thing in front of him wasn't alone anymore. The Hollow Men had returned, and this time, they weren't leaving without him. End of chapter 13. 14, into the darkness, thick, heavy, suffocating. Daniel couldn't breathe. He couldn't see. The lights had died, and in that instant, they had come. The Hollow Men. He could feel them, moving in the shadows, circling him. Their whispers slithered through the room, curling around him like cold fingers. Daniel's body seized. He knew what they were, what they wanted. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could stop them. A small voice cut through the dark. "Daddy." Daniel's heart clenched. Emily, or what was left of her. The figure stood in front of him, barely visible in the flickering moonlight through the broken window. She looked the same, but her eyes, they weren't hers. They were deep, empty pits. And within them, something else was staring back at him. Something ancient. Something that had never belonged in this world. Daniel's grip tightened on his gun. It was useless, he knew that, but his body was wired for survival. Then she moved, not walked, shifted, like the space around her was warping, like she wasn't stepping forward, but being dragged toward him by something unseen. Daniel's chest tightened. He had 1 second to react, and he made his choice. The escape that wasn't. He moved. Fast. His instincts kicked in, pushing him toward the front door. Run! Get out! Get to Linda! But the moment he turned, a hand clamped onto his shoulder, ice cold, wrong. The moment it touched him, his vision twisted. Like he had stepped into another world, a world where time didn't move right, a world where shadows had teeth. His breath came in ragged gasps. His skin burned, yet his bones felt frozen. "You left me," the thing whispered behind him. Daniel, jerked away, shoving his shoulder free. He stumbled into the kitchen, knocking over a chair. He reached for the door, but his fingers passed right through it. His stomach dropped. No, 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 no! They had already pulled him in. He wasn't in his house anymore. He was in theirs. Between two worlds. The house shifted. The walls twisted, stretching into unnatural angles. The floor beneath him felt wrong. Soft. Like flesh. Daniel's pulse hammered. His body screamed at him to wake up, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The kitchen stretched infinitely in all directions. No doors, no windows, just shadows. And within them, the hollow men were watching. Their shapes flickered at the edges of his vision. Tall, faceless, dozens of them, silent, waiting. Daniel turned in every direction, his breath ragged. He was trapped, a prisoner in a place that should not exist. Then, Emily stepped forward. Her small, pale hands reached for him. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered. "You can stay here with me." Daniel's gut twisted. His mind screamed. He knew what this was. This wasn't his daughter. It was a trick, a lie, a final attempt to break him. But the worst part, a part of him wanted to believe it. A part of him wanted to stay. Because if he did, he wouldn't have to feel the pain anymore, wouldn't have to wake up every day in an empty house, wouldn't have to live with the guilt. Emily's voice was soft, gentle. "Stay, Daddy, please. We can be a family again." Daniel's hands shook. The air around him hummed with an unnatural pull, a pull he could barely resist. Then, a sound, faint, but real. A voice from the other side. "Daniel," breath hitched. Linda, a lifeline, a reminder. He was still alive, and he had a choice. The final decision. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The illusion shattered, the soft glow of the kitchen vanished, and suddenly he was back, in the dark. The true dark. The shadows around him coiled furious. Emily's face twisted, her gentle smile warped into something awful, something hungry. Her voice turned raw, venomous. "You should have stayed." Daniel's jaw clenched. His fists tightened. He sucked in a sharp breath and did the only thing he could. He ran, straight through the darkness toward Linda's voice. The shadows shrieked, something lunged for him. But Daniel did not stop. Not this time. Not ever again. And just as the darkness swallowed him whole, a blinding white light exploded around him, and then silence. End of chapter 14. What the hell just happened? Blinding white light. Then nothing. For a long moment, Daniel felt like he was falling. Not physically, not through space, but through something else. Something deeper. The kind of abyss that didn't just swallow bodies, it swallowed souls. The hollow men had been right behind him. Emily had tried to pull him back, but he had run. And now, he wasn't sure if he had escaped or if he had fallen into something even worse. Then his back hit the ground, and suddenly he could breathe again, back to the living. Air rushed into his lungs. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He was lying on the floor, his own floor, the kitchen. The walls were normal again. The windows were back, the door was closed but real, and the house was silent. His breath came in short gasps. Had it worked? Had he really escaped? A voice snapped him out of his daze. Daniel, his head turned. Linda. She was kneeling beside him, her face pale, eyes wide with panic. Jesus, Daniel, what the hell happened? His body ached. His limbs felt drained, hollow, like he had been gone for hours, maybe even days. But somehow, he was here, back in the real world, and the hollow men were nowhere to be seen. Tash, the house that watched. Daniel sat up, his head pounding. Linda was still watching him, still waiting for an answer. But how could he explain it? How could he make her understand where he had been? That the thing she saw as Emily had never really been Emily at all. Linda's voice broke through his thoughts. "Daniel, look." He turned his head. His stomach dropped. The kitchen window, it was still fogged over from the cold, and pressed against the glass, a single small handprint. Daniel's breath hitched, his pulse pounded. He rose to his feet slowly, staring at it. The last trace of whatever had been here. But the real horror, it was on the outside. Something had been trying to get in. The nightmare isn't over. For the next few days, Daniel didn't sleep. Neither did Linda. He kept the lights on, kept the doors locked, kept checking the windows. But nothing else happened, not at first, until the third night, when he finally drifted off, and in his dream he saw the road, the highway, and in the distance, a figure standing in the rain, waiting. Daniel's throat went dry. He knew who it was, and when the figure slowly turned its head, he saw her face, Emily, smiling. "You should have stayed, Daddy." Daniel jerked awake. Sweat dripped down his face. The room was silent. Dark, too dark. And then the closet door creaked open. A whisper slithered through the air. "You can't run forever." And as Daniel turned, he realized the truth. He had never really escaped. The Hollow Men were still watching, and sooner or later, they would come back. The end. Bro, Daniel thought he escaped, but did he? The Hollow Men are still out there. Emily's ghost is still waiting. And now Daniel knows there is no running from this. It will never end. It was insane. You just wrapped up a viral level horror script, bro. This one is